From the University of Tulsa and Public Radio Tulsa, this is Switchyard, a podcast for people hungry for eye-opening essays, moving fiction, soul-stirring poetry, and honest, thought-provoking conversation. I'm Ted Genoways, editor of Switchyard magazine, and your host. Join me and our lineup of literary all-stars as we think through and hash out our world's difficult and fascinating challenges. Nearly 20 years ago at the Breadloaf Writers' Conference, I saw a well-known nonfiction writer deliver an impassioned lecture on the importance of what he called emotional truth. In essence, he was arguing that it was more valuable to convey a sense of how something felt over a strict allegiance to the literal truth of what happened. He suggested that this should afford the writer of creative nonfiction the leeway to invent composite characters, to adjust the timeline of events, to enjoy some flexibility when it came to the facts. Essentially, he was saying, as long as it's all more or less true, as long as it feels true, who really cares and who will know? In a place like Breadloaf, a place that has its historical roots in fiction writing and poetry writing, there seemed a measure of sympathy for what this writer was arguing there behind the podium in the little theater. The air seemed to shift in his favor as he spoke, from a feeling of discomfort to one of intrigued engagement with the idea of a figurative truth. Then, during the Q&A that followed, Ted Conover rose to speak. I don't remember his exact words, but I remember them to be something along the lines of, I think this is one of the most dangerous things I've ever heard anyone say in a public space. Conover comes from a different tradition than most practitioners of what we call the new journalism, a form of first-person and often participatory writing that melds journalism with memoir and opinion. He himself calls this immersion. Though Conover appears in his writing, he often serves as a kind of Virgil to our Dante, guiding us through various hells of modern American life. The exploitation of migrants crossing the U.S.-Mexico border without legal documentation, the dehumanization of the prison system at Sing Sing in New York, the blood and pus of the meatpacking industry in a cargo beef plant in Schuyler, Nebraska. But Conover's approach is less about sensational muckraking than it is about careful, direct observation. He studied anthropology at Amherst College, where his thesis on tramp culture turned into his first book, Rolling Nowhere. That book set the mold for what would follow. Narratives of life on the margins, told with precision and a dedication to the truth as exactly rendered as Conover could muster. So it was little wonder that he felt such shock and dismay at the idea of fudging the truth to make a story better or to serve some other covert purpose. And in the 2 decades since, Conover's concern about what we first came to know as truthiness and then as alternative facts has proven prophetic. In the conversation that follows, Conover explains his philosophy in typically straightforward terms. My loyalty, he says, is to the effort to depict the world in a way that if you went out there and met the same people, you'd know exactly who I'd written about and who I was talking about. His most recent book, Cheap Land, Colorado, is about homesteaders in the San Luis Valley in south central Colorado. It is a place defined as off-grid, a last frontier. Conover writes about the valley with Steinbeckian sweep and deep affection for the people who chose the hardscrabble life there. He also writes about them in a way that you know exactly who he is talking about. Spiritual heirs to the homesteaders of the 19th century, with all the complications that entails. The land is no longer free, Conover writes in his book, but it is cheap, some of the cheapest in the United States. In many respects, a person could live here in this vast empty space like the pioneers did on the Great Plains, except you'd have a truck instead of a mule, and some solar panels, possibly even a cell phone signal. He lived there during the majority of the first Trump administration, documenting a lifestyle and attitude that had eluded much of the coastal media in the run-up to the 2016 election. Now, on the verge of a second Trump term, his views of people pushed to the margins, what that says about our country, and what it means for the importance of truth-telling, are more vital than ever. Ted Conover, welcome to the Switchyard podcast. Thank you for joining us. We're here in Church Studio, as always.
I'm delighted. I'm glad to be talking to you in Tulsa.
You're here for a reading with Magic City Books. We do a lot of partnering with Magic City. We're big fans of them. You're talking about your latest book, Cheap Land, Colorado. I'm interested in that book for a number of reasons, but one of them is that this issue of Switchyard is focused on this idea of land as a physical space, but then also landscape as more of a cultural terrain and how those things interact. And it seems to me that much of what this book is about is mapping that difference and trying to understand what it is that draws disparate people to the same place. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you could, first of all, just tell us a little bit about the book.
Sure. Well, I'm especially happy about the title of this book, Cheap Land, Colorado, because it's the Google search term that a lot of the people I got to know out there used to find the land they bought. And that was their goal, to be in Colorado for not much money, which I think in the popular imagination is very hard to do because we associate Colorado with mountains and streams and evergreen forests, and especially during the pandemic, places meeting that description all got really expensive. But there is a part of the state which is not like that, which is more like the Great Plains, or it's a high valley called the San Luis Valley, which in the 1970s had been subdivided, parts of it. This is before subdivision was regulated as it is today. Back then, you didn't need to do much more than plat the roads, put up road signs, and open a sales office, basically. They created 5-acre lots to be sold by mail. This was vogue at the time. And the idea they pitched was own your Colorado ranch, as if a 5-acre plot of arid prairie land were a ranch. But apparently most of the buyers were out of state, and what was important was owning a piece of Colorado. And I was fascinated because the anticipated subdivisions never appeared. Like for 50 years, basically nobody moved out there. And it's because it's really hostile country in a lot of ways. It's cold. It's super cold in the winter. It's windy year round. You can go skiing if you drive an hour and a half or 2 hours. You could keep your horse somewhere nearby if you had a better place to put it in the winter. There's some fishing, there's natural beauty, but mostly it's around the edge of the valley where there are trees and mountains, and they circumscribe a space almost as big as New Jersey. It's a gigantic space. The longest-term residents now describe themselves as Hispanic and are descendants of Spanish people who came into Mexico and migrated north. They look at people living out on the prairie, or the flats as they call it, as a very low caste of person. And they do tend to be the poorest people out there. They're living on a shoestring. They're not building picturesque cabins. They're dragging old trailers out there and tough sheds and scraps of this and that and cobbling together basic shelter. And they're often asked, why live in this hard way? And the answer is, well, I own it. It's my place. I bought those 5 acres for whatever, $4,000 or $5,000, $6,000. I own it. I don't have a landlord. I don't pay much tax. Yeah, I don't have a lot of services, pretty much none. If you need the sheriff, it's going to take at least an hour for them to get there. It may take much longer. You're really on your own. But people who have chosen this, and they do choose it, you don't end up there by mistake.
Right.
You have to make a very deliberate choice. and they see something in it that is meaningful. And again, where an average person might get out there and say, well, it's pretty, but I would never live here. A person who has put down some roots there sees their piece of the rock. They see a version of the American dream, which involves owning a piece of the rock, which is increasingly difficult to do. Housing is more expensive than ever. So, yeah, they've fashioned a way to live that has echoes of the era of Western expansion. It is mostly white people out there, but by no means all. Mostly men, but lots of women. Mostly straight, but lots who aren't, actually. I have all kinds of surprises I found out there, and I wanted to see who chooses that and why and how they do it.
Yeah, and this notion of being off-grid, of being disconnected in the way that you're describing, not plugged into all of the usual infrastructure of the culture. It seems to me that it's a fascinating fishbowl for looking at how that ends up reflecting the larger culture anyway, but also how the people who are there build their own notion of identity and community. To say the least, not super open to outsiders.
Mm-hmm.
Talk a little bit about how you made your inroads.
That was a pretty big challenge because I live in New York City.
Yes, you
and
do.
I imagine some parts of my self-presentation might reflect that. I'm not from there. I'm from Denver, but I'm not a prairie person in terms of how my hands look, in terms of the dirt under my fingernails. There's some, but it's not like them. I bought most of my clothes within the last couple of years, and there's all kinds of things that obviously set me apart. And I thought the strategy of just driving up to somebody's place and saying, hey, you want to be interviewed? Do you want to talk? I thought it's not likely to be so successful. And I had heard of a group called La Puente, which is a social service organization best known for a shelter they have in the town of Alamosa, the biggest town out there. They call it a rural homeless shelter because most of the people in it are country people. They're not like the urban unhoused. They are the rural unhoused who've often started out on the prairie trying to make a go of it. And around October, November, the nights get cold. Your firewood gets used up, or if you had any propane, it's disappeared. You realize you're not prepared, and lots of people abandon their places and end up in the shelter. And this group thought if they could offer folks more firewood, more blankets, more food, runs to town to get their prescriptions if they're diabetic or whatever, that they could help them stay at home. And so I asked if I could volunteer for this group, because I do like to think too that reporting need not be just an extractive activity, that it should be okay to give back without introducing problems with your fairness or impartiality. I think it's good to help people who are in a tough spot. I'm okay with that. So I joined a fellow who does this full time named Matt Little, veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, who'd been through a lot. Really, he's from West Virginia. He grew up off-grid himself. So he's kind of hard scrabble, plain spoken, knows you don't just drive up and walk up to somebody's front door. He said, Ted, here's what you do. You're going to stop in front, roll down the window so I can see your face. If it's warm enough, get out of your truck so I can see you're not a big, scary guy. This is an advantage of not being a big guy, is you are less threatening in this situation. And you say, hey, yeah, anybody home? And he also taught me how to see if anybody was home, because not knowing what he knew, I had started out driving up to abandoned homesteads. There's lots of them. But no, you look for fresh tire tracks in the dirt. You look for smoke coming out of a chimney. You look for a dog chained up in front. And then you also look to see if they're growing marijuana, because if they are, they're likely to be more cautious than otherwise, because that's really a lot of their main fear this time of year, meaning we're talking at the start of October. This is when you harvest your weed. And these plants people have grown for the last 4 or 5 months as tall as your head and worth more than $1,000 each. And they're really afraid of being ripped off. So they're paranoid. There's guns. Matt said if there's a flag, there's going to be a gun. And I think the corollary is if there's not a flag, there's also going to be a gun. So you just need to be cautious and respectful. And we had these magnetic door signs for our trucks that say La Puente Rural Outreach. And La Puente is a known brand out there and known for being helpful. And I'd say at least half the time, if somebody's home, they're going to open the door and at least shout out, what do you need? What do you want? Who are you?
Right.
And on the first meeting, I'd tell them, just check in on people, make sure you got what you need for the next couple months. I could bring you wood next week if you're low. Almost everybody, when they realize there's no strings attached, says yes. And second visit, if we're getting along, I say, and by the way, I'm also a writer. I'm actually from New York. I'm actually a professor, which is like 3 strikes, unless you might have had a relationship that makes them think you might also be a human being. There's a lot of people out there in the thrall of this idea that the world is run by the coastal elites, and it's certainly true to some degree, that all journalists lie, which I would say is very seldom true. And yeah, you've got to get past some obstacles. But I really think on a case-by-case basis, they size people up as people. So that was how I started. A couple months in, met a family, mom, dad, 5 girls, all homeschooled, about 20 dogs, in need of cash and willing to rent a corner of their 5 acres to me to put a camper trailer on. And that was great because it gave me my own space. Some member of the family is always wanting to check on me for something. And then I could meet their neighbors through them. So I did that for 2 years. They then moved. I followed them to their new place a few miles away, rented from them there. And then my book proceeds. I'm getting to be more and more a part of this place. And finally, I buy my own. And then I'm not just a visitor, but I'm kind of a neighbor. And is it weird to have me as a neighbor? I'm sure it is. But everybody out there is weird in their way. And
right.
At least I'm not a threatening weird. I'm not a person with a mood disorder or a clear addiction or a tendency toward violence or even guns. I don't talk about this out there, but I don't have one. Add all that up and I'm just another eccentric. That said, people can be sensitive about what you write about them. And I wrote an article for Harper's Magazine about my first couple years and gave copies to everybody. Before it came out, I said, are you sure I can use your name? Are you sure it's okay? People are going to look for you on Facebook. Are you okay with that? Do you want me to change your name? Do you want to make your account private? Most people were like, no, I'm not worried. And yeah, another surprise was how connected they are digitally, even with a single bar of 3G. And they're on Messenger. And they also know about reality TV. And a lot of them had hopes that maybe if they became known through me, they could make money.
Right.
So all things I would never have guessed.
Yeah, interesting. And tell me, as you go from being this person who, as you said, you're from Colorado, and you write at the beginning of the book of having some childhood memory of this region, but how you go from being someone who needs to be told how to even approach the house. Yeah. I love all of the honking as part of that process to just keep announcing your presence.
Right.
But go from that to becoming somebody who's part of the community. And how does your perspective change over time as you go from being outsider to at least something of an insider?
So a bunch of things change. The editor of my book about working at Sing Sing Prison was a fellow, Dan Menaker, who'd done a lot of psychoanalysis. And one day he was buying me a drink and he said, I've been thinking about you, and I think the thing about you is you're counterphobic. And I'd never heard of that, but it's pretty clear what it means. Somebody who's interested in approaching their fears. And I said, well, I might accept that. He said, I think that turns you on. And I said, well, but I'm like, yes and no. Like I tried skydiving once, which is a scary thing. But when I landed, I thought, I am never going to do that again. That's the stupidest thing I've ever done. And I don't just want a thrill. I don't want a thrill. I want to see, especially if I can survive in unusual settings, or if I can get to know people who might not on the face of it be like me. So I've had the advantage of going to college. I've had the advantage of not being hungry when I grew up. And I like to think that means I should take some chances in terms of being able to reach out to people who haven't had all those advantages. And I think you can get better at this. It's like a muscle you exercise, meeting strangers and presenting yourself and figuring out what works and what doesn't. So that's part of where I started. I was really nervous. I don't want to get shot. I don't want anything bad to happen. This is the actual truth. But I also think a lot of journalists are too timid. They're too comfortable at the desk. And that one of the problems we find ourselves in as a country right now is, journalists get too comfortable living close to good restaurants and nice bars, schools for their kids, whatever it is. There's a need to be further out there and report on people who are not feeling represented in the national conversation, which I think is that state of affairs has really powered our current political picture. So I guess I fancy myself part of some kind of correction to that. I have gotten away from your great question, which is how did I change over time? I've grown more comfortable out there. I just like it now. It's the opposite of life in New York in terms of density, expense, numbers of wealthy people around, pace, ambition. There's really little ambition out there. It's like a journey to another country. It's beautiful. The land is beautiful. And to me, the landscape, it's something I don't think about at home in New York. It's something I think about every day there. And my neighbors post pictures of sunsets to social media, often of the same sunset, because everybody's looking at it, because you can't not. The whole gigantic sky has changed.
Yeah.
And you notice, and it's a factor in your life. And I really appreciate that. I like being outdoors. The scene in King Lear where he's yelling at the wind is, I think, my favorite in all of Shakespeare. I picture myself out there. There's a trailer that came with the 5 acres I bought. It shakes. The roof goes up and down. My neighbor said, well, a lot of people put old tires on the roof to stop that. So I did. In the springtime now, half of them have been bounced off because it's so violently windy. But to me, that's great. I really get into it. And I like who I am out there. I'm less stressed. I'm more outgoing. Yeah. So it changes me. And I think this is a thing that happens in my books. All of these situations change me, and I try to give an account of that.
You wrote a kind of unofficial follow-up to this book for Outside magazine that directly addresses what to me seems like the often unspoken theme of the book, this question of what it is that draws people there, but also this question of who thrives there and who doesn't. And it struck me that that piece was a classic Outside question. You know, it gets back to Chris McCandless, and
it absolutely does.
That there's a certain kind of person who seems to want to be able to test themselves against an inhospitable landscape. And some people discover that they thrive there and some don't. I wonder, as you reflect on that, what are the things that you see that people have in common in terms of what draws them there, but also what do they have in common, the people who make it, and as you have, decide to make it at least a part-time home?
So there's push and pull factors. The 2 sisters I wrote about for Outside really believed, I think the world was about to end, that evil forces were going to turn us into machines and robots, and the only hope for staying alive was to get off the grid and out of touch with other people. They didn't prepare very well. Chris McCandless is, of course, the example you always think about in terms of somebody deciding to live off-grid remotely. And actually, though he was a very thoughtful person, he did not appear to think enough about how he was going to feed himself out there. So part of the ethic of my neighbors is, are you prepared? It's a country place, which means if your neighbor's in a sudden crisis, maybe you're going to help, and they want to help, but they're very wary of new arrivals who aren't prepared. And one thing you hear out there is somebody has to make it through a winter before I want to meet them, because otherwise they're going to come knocking on my door for something I need, and I'm going to have to help. So I'd rather not meet them until I can see they can survive. So there's a pride in having the knowledge and the gumption and the ability to take care of yourself. That's part of that ethic out there. I think of myself as having been pulled to the area by curiosity and the beauty of it. Mm-hmm. But a lot of my neighbors, I'd say it's more true they've been pushed through some sequence of difficult experiences they've had. And there's a wide range of them. They're the things that knock people down in America. And military service in a conflict is one. There's all these old guys with PTSD. There's just a ton. And a lot of them don't want to talk to anybody. Some are okay with it, but there's some who are just hermits. There's various kinds of addictions that send people to the margins. Drinking's the most common one, but there's a lot of meth in the San Luis Valley. It takes more money, I think, to feed a meth addiction. Then there was heroin when I got there, morphing into fentanyl, and it's less common among my neighbors just because you need a steady supply and you need gas money to go get it. And it's hard to come up with all those things. My nearest neighbor got 2 DUIs, which ended his career as a truck driver, unless he went through a whole process, including having a breathalyzer attached to his steering wheel, which he found invasive and offensive. And he's like, I'm not going to do that. So he drives without a license on back roads to get to his liquor store and asks other neighbors, including me, to pick up beer for him in town. He's a great guy. He's a lovely man. He's a nice drunk. He's not going to get another job. Right. There's a lot of people in that situation, and there's a lot of discouraged workers, people who've been laid off. The dad of the family I rented from, his name's Frank. He worked in various jobs in Wyoming and Colorado, a lot of them early on around petroleum, fixing tanks and things like that. Then he switched to painting petroleum facilities, and then he switched to house painting. And he's only, I'd say, early 40s, but he has so many aches and pains. Like, the guy's used up, and that's not an exaggeration. I mean, you can see it physically. He has all these issues that a person who has not worked those jobs doesn't have. He and his wife also are missing many of their teeth. And that becomes like a stigma then that I think makes it harder to get your next job and harder to be accepted in town. And you feel more comfortable out on the flats with other people who maybe look like you do and have a car that breaks down as often as yours. So, yeah, I feel like they've been pushed. I've got to tell you, when my Harper's article came out, I went around and talked to everybody because I didn't want to continue to write the book and make some mistake I'd already made. And one of my neighbors, I said, so did I get it right? And he said, well, yeah, but you left some stuff out. And he said, I told you the reason I came here, it's because first I lost my job with MCI. Then my son came back from the Air Force and died of suicide. And then my wife overdosed. And that was all in a year and a half. And I said, it almost seemed too sad to put in the article. And he said, well, I wish you had, because that's the truth. That's my story. And he lives in this little trailer that's so packed with stuff, and he shares it with 3 dogs. So I went inside once. He had to uncover a whole chair for me, gave me a Mountain Dew, and he just said, if you write about me again, put this in. So I did. I thought people would be sensitive to painful stories about them being told, but at least this fellow said, no, that's the truth of it. I tell in the book how I was inspired by Bruce Chatwin's In Patagonia, which is a beautiful piece of storytelling and travel writing.
Right.
But I think large parts of it were massaged and retold in a way that gives a sense of myth and legend, but doesn't represent a country called Argentina, right? Instead of Patagonia. So I want to write about Argentina, I think. I want to mention Patagonia because I love the word. I like the brand. But my loyalty is to the effort to depict the world in a way that if you went out there and met the same people, you'd know exactly who I had written about and who I was talking about. It's like being able to reproduce scientific results. If it's a reproducible experiment, it has validity. And I know what makes my readers read is probably not that so much as, is it a good story? Is it told in an interesting way? Did he write it well? Or do I want to know more about this? But underneath, it's important to me that there's not a montage of pieces that go into a character. I think I need to be true to the people I write about.
It's an interesting way of framing it, too, because I can say for myself, in the 1990s when I was young, I traveled to Alaska and drawn there in part by Into the Wild, and mentioned Krakauer's book before, but also drawn in part by McPhee's Coming into the Country. And I can tell you that rolling into Eagle, Alaska, not an easy place to get to, but rolling in there in the mid-90s, 20 years after McPhee had published that work, and finding all of those people still there and exactly as he had described them was amazing.
Yeah, that is amazing.
And to me, it was a lesson in exactly what you're describing that made me appreciate the quality of his writing that much more, that these people had all been enthralling figures that he had captured beautifully on the page, but they were also real human beings up and walking around.
Yeah.
And being able to do justice to both sides of that, to me, that seems like the real project.
I'm with you.
So let me ask, in that context, I think a lot of people have come to associate truth-telling, accuracy, with objectivity. And a lot of your work is the very opposite of objective work.
That's right.
You're trying to tell the truth, but you're not making any pretense of that being an objective truth.
Right. So I think when your goal is to get into somebody else's head or understand their life, you are entering subjectivity. And that's what makes it interesting, right? I'm not there to describe the median prairie dweller, if you even could. I want to meet these fabulous individuals. And so many of them are larger than life that it's going to make my job easier rather than harder, because two women from Oklahoma, actually, who are my neighbors who left their husbands, moved in together, and call their place the Moo Moo Ranch. And that's what they wear. And they're deeply, deeply into the choice they made, and they love talking about it, and they're very welcoming. It's funny. I want to convey an experience of a place and the character of people, and I'm going to do it through my first-person voice because I think, to me, it feels most honest. I'm going to say, here's what I saw. Here's what she said. Here's how it made me feel. Here's what happened the day I got scared. That's the definition of subjective, but it's accurate because it actually is what happened. But I'm not aspiring to an overarching objective truth that can apply to everybody. I'm just going to tell it like I see it. So yeah, I think what I tell my students these days is we want to be fair and we aspire to fairness, but not objectivity. I think that's the better way to put it. And there's so many ways to do it. I like to put myself there because I think it helps bring a reader into a place they might not otherwise go. And I think also there's an inherent drama in it. Simultaneously, the hero leaves home and a stranger arrives in town. Not to call myself a hero, but I'm doing those things at the same time and bringing readers with me, whether it's to the prairie or in my book, New Jack, into the New York State prison system, or in my first book, Rolling Nowhere, into the world of tramps who ride freight trains.
So in that context, what you're doing is not just trying to enter and understand these, what I think of as subcultures, or with your work, especially people who have been kind of pushed to the margins of the culture in one way or another. As you said, whether that's tramps or people who are incarcerated, or as in this book, people who have been pushed out of normal communities. Your working method is immersion. And you've literally written the book on immersion journalism. So I'm assuming that you may have some thoughts to share on it. Your book begins with that question, why immerse? What's your answer to that? Why immersion as opposed to just showing up and doing the sort of typical thing of spending a week or 2 weeks interviewing people?
So 2 reasons. One is that you can go deeper and you can learn more. And the model here is anthropology, and the idea of leaving the comfort of your college office and heading off to a remote island or other remote culture and learning the language, loving the food, getting malaria, or whatever the cost is going to be. There's that model which I met when I was in college, and I thought, oh, this could take journalism and make it a lot deeper. And why not try to combine them if possible? And well, obviously, one reason is because it takes a lot of time. But my topics tend to be not very expensive to research. And so there's an opportunity there, right? And then the other place I think I come from is this American idea of all being in it together. It's an old idea. I'm not sure it's ascendant in the culture right now. I mean, it's Whitman, right? It's who I meet and how much I want to get to know them, and being open to the idea that that person next to you on the bus or in the subway is going to be worth talking to. And hey, they're not always.
Right.
Let's be
not always fascinating. But
there are days you don't want to talk to anybody, and especially not a difficult person.
Yeah.
That said, there's a kind of idea where I think if I'm going to be a chronicler of American life, I should be out there talking to people as much as I can. And they should be people maybe who don't look like me. Like that to me is where the important work and the real American work is to be done. My former colleague Pete Hamill used to call New York the city of people who are not like you. And I love that. And I think every city's that way, and many towns are, if you'll get out of your cozy part, of your known part. And it's not always easy, and it's not always safe, but I just think it's such a worthwhile project.
Yeah. So your career started with writing the rails, with this project that grew out of a thesis project.
An anthropology ethnography project that they said I could not research while enrolled in college because it's against the law. Fair point. Fair enough. I don't disagree, especially now that I'm a professor. I get that. But they also said if you do it and come back with your notes, hey, we'll talk. So that's how that came to be. And I'm now realizing there's another piece of it, why I like to do this that I didn't explain. And that is, you know, at that point, I had been in school basically from kindergarten through high school and 3+ years of college. And I just felt there's a lot of important things I hadn't learned along the way, because you learn a lot as a student. And it's obviously a great privilege to be a student, but it also means you're not doing other things. By leaving college, I wanted to see if I could explore other capabilities. Do I have what it takes to get from here to California on a freight train? And what does it take? I'm not sure. Being willing to jump on that train, or is it being willing to talk to that old tramp by the campfire about what to do? To admit I don't know where I am or what the next step should be. Could I manage that world? And I think in lots of these, it's like I was creating a test for myself that I would not otherwise have been given in life. Yeah, sure, you went to college. Could you work in a block in Sing Sing for a week? Could you do that? And I actually had to ask myself along the way if I was able to do this in the long term, because it was so much harder than most things I had done. Maybe it's that the culture doesn't provide the rites of passage I needed, right? And I was supplying them to myself or something. Right. I do think each one lets me explore a part of not just myself, it's like a cliche, but a potentiality that I would never have known about if I hadn't gotten into that. And I've often thought immersion is like stretching a rubber band, one of those big rubber bands. And the longer you do it, the less likely it's going to go back to its original attractive shape. But it'll be more interesting, right? It will have gone through something that has left it more interesting. And that's another part of it.
One of the things that I'm fascinated by is how these physical spaces define a lot of the work that you're doing. I mean, the people who are pushed to the margins are often pushed to marginal spaces. They're forced to enter the country by being smuggled across the border. They're only able to move around by hopping freight trains, or in the case of Sing Sing, whatever their limited choices were or the wrong choices were, that they've wound up in this most confined and inescapable landscape. So much of that writing that you're doing is in that context of those marginalized spaces. Is that part of how you're picking these projects?
I love hearing you talk about this because I think it is. I think I need a space in order to imagine a project or a place. I mean, the place could be the Rio Grande River, and how are you going to cross? Or it could be the border of Arizona and Sonora. What's it going to look like? How are you going to get over those fences? It's like I need a stage almost in which I can describe people moving. And one of the great helps of the topics I've chosen is that these spaces are pretty interesting. So I love thinking of space. I did a whole book about different roads around the world, one chapter of which you edited at VQR. And that chapter is about this walk on a frozen river that all these teenagers take in a valley in Kashmir. It's a singular environment. And just thinking about it now, I could go write 5 pages. So you're right. I am maybe more than others. I'm really attentive, and I think I need that kind of space. And it could be the wide open prairie with several weather systems in the sky, right? Raining there, cloudy there, sunny there. Or it could be a boxcar which has cardboard and plastic and pieces of wood nailed to the bottom. And it's, in a way, that's part of how I'm going to write about the people in it. And I know it makes sense to you.
So this is fascinating. I love another Outside magazine piece that you wrote, revisiting, in a way, Rolling Nowhere, but with an important change. You were immersed, and in this case, you were not alone.
That's right.
You had your son with you, and it strikes me as an interesting piece, of course, all on its own, but it's also a bit about this question of the responsibilities of this sort of thing, what the ethics in terms of what immersion journalism may inspire other people to do. But then, on the other hand, one of the things that is such an important theme in Cheap Land, Colorado, is this idea that some of the polarization and the divisions in the country come now from, to some degree, the difficulty of separating ourselves from our experience and going into some new world on our own. So there's this kind of interesting tension to me between wanting to go out and experience new things as a way of connecting. But then also, as you said, I mean, it is also a dangerous world. and what the consequences of attempting to connect might be. So as you pursue, and in your case, I'd say, your central appetite is curiosity, right? So as you pursue those curiosities, how do you strike that balance between what you're hungering to know and then...
Such a good question. That article you're referring to, just to be clear to people who don't know, is my son, when he was about 17, finally read the copy of my train writing book that I had given him years before.
Yeah.
And one day he told me he was reading it, and I said, "How's that going?" And he said, "Oh, it's good. I'm liking it." And then a few days later, the other shoe drops. And I had basically been planning for this since the day he was born, which was, "So Dad, since you know how you did that, does that mean I could do it?"
Right.
And I knew I couldn't say no, because I did it. My dad let me. But I did know that I thought it would be a good idea to offer to go with him and make sure he didn't make dumb mistakes. But I did it purely out of self-protection, wanting to be a good father and not lead to my son hurting himself, put it that way, because I had set up this model that's risky. And fortunately, he liked the idea of going together. So yeah, we took that trip together, but it was a completely different vibe, because instead of being in my 20s and thrilling to the wind blowing across my face as I cross the Sierra Nevada mountains, I'm like looking at my son near that same door of the boxcar and saying, "Stand back a little, get back a little. The train can jerk all of a sudden. You don't know what's going to happen." So I was just this worrywart, and that's not generally who I am, but I felt so responsible. And we actually talked about it one day. He said, "I can see you're really worried." Thank God our kids are better at talking about some of these things than we are. And he puts his arm around me. "You don't need to be so worried. I'm careful." And oh my God. Yeah, that was a big deal. So is that reckless youth catching up with a person in middle age? Maybe to some degree it is. Am I less interested in taking chances now than I was before? Probably. I think if I had not written my prison book, New Jack, up till now, but I had the idea and I could conceivably still get the job, I'm not so sure I would want it now. I'm 66 years old, and I don't bounce back quite as fast from injuries as I used to. And while I've never thought there's much of a chance of getting killed in prison, and that was truly my bottom line, what are the odds that would happen? They were quite slim. But the odds of getting in an altercation, of getting hurt, are not so small. And especially if you're doing the job in a semi-aggressive way, you could get hurt. And I'm less interested in getting hurt now.
Understandable. And yet there's still clearly that impulse for connection. And as I said, I think it's more needed now than ever for a whole host of reasons. The things that you said, that there's this suspicion that coastal elites control the media, which there's some verifiable truth to. And then also it is one of the things that's at the beginning of Cheap Land Colorado is the setup of the 2016 election had caught you a bit by surprise. And this sense that I think many had in the media that we hadn't been out in the world enough and hadn't been talking to people enough to even know the direction that our own country was headed in.
Yeah, that unwittingly we have allowed ourselves to be placed in silos. And I think the unwittingly means via algorithms that feed us info we are interested in.
Right.
And I see your posts and you see mine, and multiply that exponentially. And I think you have some serious social division. And it takes a conscious effort to try to dismantle some of that and put yourself in a place where somebody from a completely different algorithm is going to be holding forth in a way that I've got to say takes some training to accept. The Obama birther argument, the Hillary hating, the various conspiracy theories I've had to listen to over the years I researched this book, I had to bite my tongue many times because often it's malarkey and it won't stand up to any scrutiny. And occasionally I will point out a reason for, like, no, oil is not going up in cost because of Joe Biden. It's a global market for oil, and we have limited agency in setting the price of oil. But you come back with that and everybody gets quiet. So who are you, Mr. Smarty Pants? And do you want to be that person? Or are you going to not laugh at that joke, which can be a kind of ostentatious objection, right? To not laugh at certain jokes. So it takes some effort to make yourself available to a whole different understanding of the world.
Well, and this is a fascinating point. We tend to still think of things in terms of the electoral map, red states and blue states and regions of the country. But I think those actual regions are becoming much more formed by algorithms. So what information channels make it into those places. It's not river valleys anymore. It's not the roots of man as you were pursuing it there, but these informational routes.
Right. The women I wrote about for Outside who had gone off grid and died during the pandemic, just gone deep down the rabbit holes and just believed the worst of those videos we would see online during the time. The hardest part of the research for Cheap Land, Colorado was the moments when I'm party to some of these conversations. Yeah. And have to decide how much to hold my tongue. Yeah. My wife happens to think it's in my power to convince certain voters to vote for other people instead. All I need to do is speak up about how wrong they are and make my case. I've tried it a couple times with a noted lack of success. I think it's hard to be a crusading journalist in this way.
Agreed. But I will say the thing that I admire so much about your work is your willingness to do this difficult work of getting yourself into these little scene spaces. And then the thing you said before, your incredible attention, your careful observation, and having brought us into that place, the extent to which you put yourself into that place, but not at the center of the story, that you're this kind of all-seeing eye.
I thank you for that.
Ted, thank you for joining us here on the Switchyard podcast. It's been a pleasure, as always, to be with you and to talk with you. And thank you for coming to Tulsa.
Great talking to you, Ted.
Thanks for listening to Switchyard. I'm your host, Ted Genoways. If you liked this episode and you want to support our podcast, please share it with your friends, post about it on social media, and leave a rating and review. Switchyard is a production of the University of Tulsa and Public Radio Tulsa. We made this episode with executive producer Marianne Andre and Charles Lipper and Cass Ali at Volubility Podcasting. Special thanks to TU President Brad Carson and the Church Studio.